5 productos tropicales blandos, esto es café, cacao, azúcar, algodón y jugo de naranja. Consultora, conferencista y educadora en negocios internacionales que ofrece liderazgo intelectual sobre los factores claves, las tendencias críticas y los problemas que pueden afectar el precio de las materias primas blandas en cualquier punto de la cadena de suministro global. Experta en la materia en diversos casos legales sobre materias primas, que proporciona datos e información para facilitar la preparación de juicios. También es citada frecuentemente en los principales medios financieros de comunicación, como lo son The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, CNN, CNBC, Barron's y Bloomberg. El día de hoy nos va a hablar y a traer una conferencia con el tema ¿el precio del cacao, bendición o maldición? Ahí la interrogante, ella lo responde y le damos la bienvenida.
So I have my computer here because I'm speaking in English, and if I start reading in Spanish, then you're going to hear me talk like the American gringo in Spanglish, and so I have my English here to not throw me off. So I will tell you, yesterday, so I can understand Spanish fairly well, but yesterday, just to give you an example, I was hearing someone say the word ropa, and they were really saying Europa, and I was saying cocoa, clothes, tight-fitting. You know, I was like trying to make the connection, and then I look at the screen and I understood. So that's why I'm just trying to be a little careful here, because my Spanish is not perfect when it comes to speaking yet. But when it comes to talking about the market, cacao, I can talk a New York mile a minute. I've been covering the markets for 42 years, and we are in an unprecedented time, not only because of the price being at historically high levels, but also on the external pressures that the entire supply chain is facing. And it's just not unique to this market. I cover other commodities, as was mentioned, and I see the same patterns, whether it's in the coffee market or in textiles or in sugar. It's the exact same problems through the supply chain and the pressures from every which angle. And so I'm going to focus on the cocoa market here, but understand this is a global phenomenon that almost every industry is facing. And we have to understand where this is coming from and the pressure points, then how do we resolve some of that and have a sustainable business? So first off, when you think in terms of the cocoa market, from the agricultural perspective, it's a beautiful crop, it's an amazing tasting product, and it's the backbone of a global chocolate industry that's worth over $130 billion annually, of which we all know from the producer side, only a very small portion of that, it actually goes back to the producers. And so there's always the question of how do we equalize the market? How do we bring more money back to the producers to have sustainable production? And it's a difficult answer to swallow because a lot of the money in terms of how the industry is being measured is because of industrial production and marketing and branding and the cost of bringing a product to the market. And therefore, as you move up the value chain and you put a product in consumer nations where the cost of living is much higher, the relative earnings in terms of the outright dollars seems enormous. But in terms of the percentages earned, it's not that much different. And there's a lot of cost pressure, price pressure, margin pressure on some of the major manufacturers also, that they're still trying to grapple with, and especially in the past 2 years with prices as they are. So we're at this inflection point where prices have been rising, but the risks are increasing just as quickly. First, let's talk from the production side. Production is under threat. Aging trees, disease, climate volatility. And that's not changing. If I look at the different countries of high productivity countries, there is the challenge in terms of labor, aging producers, and how to combat climate change. And I've been to 112 countries, of which many are producing countries, whether it's coffee, cocoa, cotton. And I've been on farms all over the world. And it's the same problem that I see over and over again that needs to be addressed. Because otherwise, we're going to see peak productivity happen while demand is continuing to rise. And so we're at that, I call it that inflection point for the market. The downside to that of high prices is that consumers, meaning the manufacturers, when they're not making sufficient funds to keep stakeholders happy, then they take decisions that work against producers. And part of that is where they are switching ingredients. They're cheapening their costs. The other side on that pressure is that consumers are demanding more from the entire supply chain in terms of better quality, traceability, and sustainability. And if that isn't delivered, then they send messages to the major manufacturing companies, we aren't going to accept your product. And there's backlash. And so the industry needs to work hand in hand on a more closer basis than ever before to sort of combat some of the pressures from the actual end user and the consumers of what the pressures they're putting on the manufacturers, and sometimes it's impossible to meet those demands. So we have the perfect storm, and it's pushing every part of the value chain to adapt, or you're going to be left behind. So let's take a look at prices. And what you can see here is that we had 150% year-over-year increase in the price in New York. We went to the highest level ever. The previous high was in the 1970s. The supply became very, very constrained because of consecutive years of global shortfalls, and that was due to mostly crop disease, weather, and specifically underinvestment in West Africa. So we had this trifecta of problems that occurred, and we had the first year of supply shortfall, second year, and then a third year, which pushed the market over the edge. The problem is that for this season, production didn't recover as everybody expected. So if you go back, and I have the data for cocoa production on a global basis going back into the 1940s, some countries even before that. And if you look, always when there's a production problem, the rebound in production is normally quick. High prices are the best cure for high prices. So this is really one of the first times where, one, you've had two of the largest cocoa producing countries have a production difficulty at the same time, but at the same time span, they didn't snap back as quickly. And that's because of the proliferation of disease. And also some of the stresses that have been going on for a long time with underinvestment. So the question is, why did this happen? And we know that there's problems on the farms, but particularly for the Ivory Coast and Ghana, they are not free countries in terms of their supply chain. So in the Ivory Coast and Ghana, you have the old-fashioned colonial boards that control the price. So the Ivory Coast and in Ghana, the government determines what the price is before the season ever begins, the farm gate price. And they announce that price, and that is the price that the producer must accept for the year. And that price, sometimes they're trying to target it at about 70% of the average price, but it doesn't always work that way. And a few years ago, there was a situation where Ghana and the Ivory Coast demanded from major manufacturers that they had to pay them an even higher price above the market, a living income differential of $400. But did that money go to the producer? And the answer is no, because if it went to the producer, then we wouldn't have had the underinvestment and the problems that we have today from those two countries. And so it becomes a dilemma. And you're not going to give up and turn to a free market condition because of obvious reasons that I don't have to say in terms of where the money is going. Okay, so this is why production isn't coming back so quickly. And other countries like Ecuador have to be the success story and lead the way. So world production, if you look at historically, you can see that it's a uptrend. There's a few years where production came down and then higher prices and a quick recovery. It spurred investment on a global basis. And then in the past several years, we had production start to level off. And the recovery that we're seeing isn't like in other periods where the global production was able to snap back as quickly as it has been. There's also something else I want to point out, and that is there's a history in the cocoa market where certain producers had very strong production and then hit their downfall. Brazil, when I first started looking at the market back in 1983, Brazil was the second largest producer in the world. And then witch's broom wiped out that production. Malaysia used to be a substantial producer. And now Malaysia has less than 5,000 tons of production, but imports 250 to 300,000. Indonesia, a few years ago, well, time passes, so a decade ago, okay? I don't want to age myself that quickly. So a decade ago, Indonesia was bragging that they were going to surpass Ghana and become the second largest producer. And they were going to produce over 1 million tons a year. And now Indonesian production is 200,000. And it was disease, just like Malaysia. And I'll talk about it and I'll show you the graphs on it. So the concern, like in my mind, is we've had 3 out of 3 that didn't come back. And are we going to have the same situation now with either the Ivory Coast or Ghana with peak production and their production starting to decline? Or are they going to be able to turn it around? And we all know that with cocoa diseases, when you pass a certain point of infection, that it's very hard to control trees, and trees will die, and you need to replant. You need to wait to replant, and it's expensive, and the farmers don't have the money. Because you're talking about farmers that have 1 to 4 hectares, do not have the education, do not have the support systems. And so are we at peak production? In Ghana, you have illegal cocoa mining, and the Galamsey, they will bulldoze over the farm. They'll offer a producer some money, say, take this, and if the producer refuses, generational farmers, they refuse, well, guess what? They're going to do something in terms of the land and the water to keep it that the streams aren't reaching the farm. They're going to destroy the farmer's livelihood anyway. And then where do we expand? Because a lot of the production increases in these countries has been in the forests. Well, that's taboo now. And so it is a very concerning factor, is how is production going to keep pace with demand because of these new stresses. So keep that in mind as you're looking at the graphs and as I'm speaking at some of the problems and challenges that other countries are facing. Sometimes it always looks like the grass is greener on the other side, but I will tell you here in Ecuador, it is very, very green compared to other cocoa producing